This is Zeyad Ramadan, founder of Purify Your Gaze, and you're listening to the Coffee with Karim podcast. Most users of pornography are men. The spouse oftentimes is the wife. It's not always the case. And oftentimes those fantasies become twisted. It becomes about abusing. It's about power.
Welcome to another episode of Coffee with Karim. I am your host, Karim Sirajuddin. Joining me once again today is brother Zeyad Ramadan, founder of Purify Your Gaze. He had one of the top 10 episodes of Coffee with Karim. That's episode 9. Check it out when you have the chance. Zeyad, thank you so much for joining me again.
Thank you, Karim. Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. So Purify Your Gaze, for those of us that don't know, is a organization that helps Muslims around the world with unwanted sexual behaviors. And you know, Brother Zeyad, some people have messaged me from hearing episode 9, and I did one much later, just kind of talking about emotional intimacy as one of the core reasons why, from my observation working with our lovely community, that this addiction tends to take place. And some people have asked, okay, what would be some, quick tips perhaps that we could generally share if you had any to offer for those who are in the thick of it right now?
Mm-hmm. Get help. Reach out to Purify Your Gaze. I think what happens is that the mind is like, I'm okay. I can kind of handle this right now by myself. And it's really the trick. It's a trick of shaitan, number one. And number two, it's part of the larger pattern. And I've seen this over tens and tens of thousands of people. The disease, the addiction pattern is the same. There is that, I can do this by myself. And then it becomes worse and worse over time. And I think the greatest thing you can do is breaking the cycle of isolation. And having that a sense of accountability, having someone, and it's not even like, hey, you're doing something wrong, you need to stop, but really having a space where that's the hardest thing to overcome is that cycle of shame. Mm-hmm. The shame keeps you trapped and you feel bad as a human being, you feel bad as a Muslim, and that in turn increases the desire to self-medicate and turn to the behaviors once again. So when you recognize that these behaviors are serving a purpose, even if they are wrong, even if they are not the best behaviors, they're serving a purpose, they're meeting some sort of need. And when you have someone there objectively where you can kind of take a look at, why am I doing this? What role is it serving in my life? You'll be able to find a better and healthier outlet, inshallah ta'ala, for yourself. So that's the best recommendation I can give is don't wait until things become drastically bad before you decide that I need to reach out for help. If you want to get an idea of where things are at on the spectrum of health, we have a quiz on our website. Just go to the Purify Your Gaze website. Right there on the front page, there should be a button that says take the quiz or something to that effect. And you'll get your score on the spectrum of from healthy sexuality to unhealthy sexuality. And from there, inshallah ta'ala, just send us a message and we're happy to support.
Ameen. Thank you so much for that, Brother Zeyad. And inshallah, Brother Zeyad and I do have intention to try to do this a little more often and share some more tips and gems for those of us who are in this journey right now. But of course, sign up today at PYG and get that custom support or join our community. And one of that first steps of just feeling that sense of solidarity, that I'm not alone. And as Brother Zeyad said, shame is one of the things that keeps us down. And by definition, shame is the fear of belonging, the fear of not belonging, right? It's the fear of I can't really connect or be valued with my family, the world, or my spouse, or even myself, or Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So, one of the things that we'll talk about in the future, inshallah, is how to cultivate courage, compassion, and connection in one's life. And I find that these are powerful keys for us to accomplish in the process of recovery, as well as, generally speaking, to optimize in ourselves.
Alhamdulillah.
So moving to today's topic, Zeyad, what I wanted to dive into is half of the people that come to PYG are often married. They have spouses. And the sisters, of course, are dealing with this situation. Sometimes they're aware, sometimes they aren't aware. Sometimes they catch their husbands, and that's what makes them finally go, okay, enough is enough. I finally have to, do something about this. It's no longer my little secret. So I wanted to talk today a bit more about what key things do the sisters who have husbands in recovery, or who just found out but they're not necessarily feeling like they want to support them. Maybe we can talk about the two different categories. So let's say the wives that know it's happening and they want to help their husband no matter what, and then there's the wives who know it's happening and they just kind of have this you're messed up, you're sick, and go heal yourself, fix yourself, and don't, think that, you're going to touch me or talk to me until that happens. And that, of course, has its own consequences, which can be detrimental. So I want to unpack those two categories.
I want to qualify the discussion first and foremost. Yes, while there is an overwhelming majority, the generalization is that most users of pornography are men. The spouse oftentimes is the wife. It's not always the case. There are cases where the scenario is reversed, where the user is also, or the one who is addicted is, in this case, the wife, and it's the opposite, or the unwanted pattern of behavior, or turning online for relationships, love, etc., is coming from the wife. So I just kind of want to put that out there, because while the overwhelming majority of the cases we see at Purify Your Gaze are men, married men reaching out, I do want to make room or space for our sisters who may be struggling, or also, since we're talking about spouses, the husbands that have a spouse, or their spouse is the one that's struggling. So if we can keep the conversation, if we can make room for that possibility in our conversation, that would be awesome.
No, I'm glad you brought that up. And rarely, there probably are cases where both spouses are addicted.
Exactly.
I remember speaking to a couple once about that. They used to, find themselves always needing to have it on while they themselves were being intimate, which is a whole other category. But yeah, let's start with this first category. Either husband or wife are users of pornography or any other type of unwanted sexual behavior. What's the first thing that these spouses need to know if they're on the end of helping their spouse in this journey?
So we're speaking to someone whose spouse is using or is addicted.
Correct.
First and foremost, it's what I want to say is it's not your fault. It's not your responsibility to change your spouse's behaviors. From an observation, what I've seen is that more often than not, the behavior has started long before your spouse was even a part of your life. And what happens, because sex is sexual intimacy is such a personal thing, it's something so special you share with your significant other. When that betraying behavior happens, the natural conclusion is that it must be me. It must be something I didn't do. And so the mind races looking for, when something like this happens, we're looking for meaning. We're looking for why. We're ultimately trying to answer, why is this happening to me? What is the reason for this? Because we're trying to end that pain, that sense of pain or discomfort. So the brain oftentimes comes to the conclusion that I did something or I didn't do something, and that's why this is happening. So what the most important thing that you can do is not personalize it, not to say that it's my fault. It's my fault, or I'm responsible for their behavior. Your spouse, we are all going to be tried, or all going to be held accountable for our own selves. So what your spouse doesn't do, we're not responsible for. And I want to kind of let that marinate before diving into a second step. What are your thoughts on that?
Okay. Yeah. So I heard you say that the first thing we have to recognize is it's not our fault, and it's also not our responsibility, in the sense that we shouldn't blame ourselves if our spouse is indulging in this behavior and somehow we think that there must be a cause, and since I am the wife or I am the husband, I must be the cause. But let me challenge that for a second, because I know there might be some, individuals out there who will say, well, you know what, my spouse doesn't take care of themselves. They let themselves go. Part of the reason why I do use pornography is because they're not very intimate or involved in their own self-care and beautification. Is that just an excuse, Ustaz Ziyad, or is that, have some legitimacy for some people in your experience?
So I would flip the question back and say, why is your spouse, it sounds like your spouse is overwhelmed. How are you helping to help her or him to make space to care for themselves, where they have the space to entertain or to be open? If we're looking at specifically the wives, that and we're coming to the generalization, the gender roles of where the wife is predominantly involved in the house or the rearing of the children, and especially young children. How are you taking care, or how are you stepping up to help at home so that your wife or your spouse has space to care for themselves and to get into that sphere where they feel quote unquote sexy to be in that space with you? So I would turn that around, and that is a pattern of, I think it's one thing to blame and say that they're not doing enough, and it's another thing to take a look and see, hey, that this may be a reason why my spouse has let herself or himself go, and that is impacting my ability to be attracted to them. So how can I be a part of the solution, right? And we want to always we always want to be turning towards each other and looking at how we can help one another rather than pointing fingers, because it doesn't. You're in it together, so it doesn't solve anything.
Of course,
if you just point and blame.
Right. And this is a great example and kind of connects to this idea of, let's say, sportsmanship, teamwork, partnership, right? A marriage is a team, and it's a partnership. So when a team loses a game, does the coach say it's all, the guard's fault? We're talking about basketball in this context, right? Or the power forward's fault? Or obviously everybody has a role to play. You can't say, oh, I missed all my shots because you didn't pass the ball in time. We that doesn't go that far. It's all their fault is not going to get you far. And rather, like you said, we have to ask ourselves, and I sometimes I notice this with certain people, right? It's like they complain about this and they say, okay, well, when you come home, what do? They come home and they do nothing. They just sit and watch TV and think that by 10 p.m. the wife's going to be ready to, explore this world of pleasure and sensuality. It's like, no, when you come home, pick up all the toys that are on the floor. It's there. It's just sitting there. Pick it up. Help with giving the child a bath, because all those little things will, let's say, free your wife up an hour or 2 hours, or your husband at the end of the evening, and you'll actually get more of that quality time. And when you have more of that time for intimacy, you're more likely going to increase in deepening that intimacy. This is the point you're making.
Yeah, and the second question I would ask is, what was your excuse before you were married? And we'll say, oh, well, I'm indulging in these behaviors because I'm not married yet. So if we're just looking objectively at the pattern, right, there's always a reason to use, and that's there's always a reason to turn to the behavior. Oh, I did well, when you I had a hard string of projects at work. I deserve a way to celebrate. I'm having a hard time. I deserve a release. My wife is not available, or my spouse is not available. I need to do something. I'm not married. I have no other options. I need to do something. So there's always a revolving door of reasons, especially when we're looking at, and it's not to look at those reasons are bad things. Those are all needs. But what we're calling into question is the way you're responding to those needs, right? And especially when you have someone else there, how are you meeting their needs so they can also be in a space where this is something that you share together. Just sorry to be crude here. Your spouse isn't your dumping grounds for your sexual energy. So elevate the space to something more sensual, more spiritual,
more human,
more sacred. Yeah, more sacred, that it becomes a shared experience for the both of you. Now, it could become a conversation where where you bring up and say, hey, we're not being close together, but the way you're doing that is you're not assuming blame, you're not pointing fingers, you're not shaming. That's a completely separate than what we've discussed just the past few minutes.
And it certainly doesn't help if you're already a user and married, and this frame of reference that you're downloading into your skull and heart every day of all these hours of content, and you're constantly comparing your wife or husband to that. Naturally, there's going to be a displeasing state, right? Because there's just millions of categories you're now comparing this feature with that feature. And also, if you're the type who's been criticizing your spouse about their looks or their body image, that person's not going to be very motivated in doing cartwheels to the gym anyways, right? So all of these things that you're suggesting here is about really how do we have more excellence and beauty and intimacy and humanism in how we relate to each other and how we facilitate these deeper connections. It's not enough to just go, well, I need this and they're not available and I'm waiting, and if they don't do it, then I blame them and I give myself an excuse to fulfill in a damaging way.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think one thing I would add to this is that while the behavior is a sexual behavior, your motivations to turning to it is not about sex. So I'll repeat that one more time. So while the behavior is sexual in nature, your motivations for turning to it are not about sex. And when a behavior becomes an addiction, that motivation changes. So we all have a need to eat. We all have a need for sex. We all have a need. We have these genuine needs, and yes, they need to be fulfilled. But when something becomes an addiction, there is an underlying motivation. There is something deeper than the surface, psycho-emotional, psycho-spiritual, existential in a sense, where this becomes your means, your vehicle defining your it's how your life becomes organized. It's in a sense a maladaptive spiritual vacuum, and it becomes a means to finding certainty in your life. It becomes a means instead of, and we say, well, I'm a Muslim, Allah's for that. But if we look at the behavior itself, in a sense, it's kind of competing with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, where because you're unable to connect, you're unable to, it's what you talked about earlier, experience intimacy. And we're talking about the emotional intimacy, the space to feel, the space to express yourself. This becomes a way to mute and numb and distract yourself from that. So at its core, there is that emotional intimacy component that, and many times there are skills, there are maybe experiences you had in your life or beliefs you have around vulnerability, beliefs you have around expressing yourself, negative experiences you had where you felt, or you arrived at the conclusion that it wasn't safe to be yourself. It wasn't okay to express yourself in that way. So this was how you responded. You clammed up, closed up. And these behaviors become a kind of a safe place for you to let yourself out. But it only corners you and it keeps you trapped. And that's why you feel suffocated. You feel that sense of despair. You feel, and it magnifies inability to be vulnerable, the inability to experience intimacy. You may have had feelings or challenges or traumatic experiences that challenged your ability to be yourself, that challenged your ability to be open. And there may be some skills, or it may not have been modeled for you in your family. So it becomes, so having that space with counseling, having that space where you're working on yourself, whether we call it recovery, whether we call it psychotherapy, whether we call it just personal development, those fundamental skills are necessary for you to have that level of intimacy between yourself and Allah, the level of intimacy between you and your spouse. And when that's not there, it leaves room for something like an addictive behavior to fill that void. And it's trying to fill that void. And if we segue to the spouses, it's helpful to have that perspective, to see that all of this is happening. It doesn't excuse the hurt. It doesn't justify, especially in the context of having a spouse that justifies their behavior and says that the reason that they're doing that is because of you or what you didn't do, and they point fingers. It's hard not to take those things in personally when your spouse has said those things. But that's what's helped. That's the machinery that's beneath the surface of all addictions.
Right. And, just to give kind of a concrete example of an experience that somebody may have gone through, let's say it's not even a major abuse or trauma, but, some families, for example, there's very little vulnerability and intimacy to begin with. So if I grew up in a household where my parents never really expressed intimacy or love or affection, or there was one parent that what they say goes and everyone else has to shut up and there's no, expression of anything other than this person, this person's way, that's going to now stunt this individual in emotional intelligence and vulnerability and intimacy that you're talking about. And akhi, sometimes the husband and wife come from families that are like this. So that cocktail can also increase the likelihood of addictions or escapism. And it may be pornography for one person, it could be eating for another, or television for another, or even, religiosity for another, right? Like I've seen that happen. I just kind of go into this spiritual bypassing of I'm quoting Islam all day, but when it comes to the real work of being vulnerable, taking responsibility, accepting I have flaws, you don't really see that, even though they're quoting Quran and Sunnah all day. So there's a lot of ways that this can manifest and play out. And I think that's important for the audience to know that we're not just talking about very severe backgrounds and developmental traumas here. It could be just what you thought was a typical standard Muslim family, but as you get older, you realize, wow, there's a huge void in me that has never been filled, and till now, I don't know how to fill it, but this has been, my drug of choice has been serving that cause to an extent.
Yeah. And I think if we kind of circle back to what we started the conversation about fault and blame versus responsibility. So one of the misconceptions that many people have is that if I experience betrayal, specifically sexual or emotional betrayal, it means it's the end of my marriage, right? And it could be the tipping point where the marriage ends, the relationship ends. It depends on how egregious of an offense it is. More often than not, that betrayal, right? It's the tip of the iceberg. There are issues, there are challenges, there are things to be worked on as a couple and in both at an individual level. And the goal is not to solve the problems. The goal is to experience a loving, fulfilling relationship where the both of you can grow spiritually, mentally, psychologically, emotionally, and can become the best versions of yourselves as you traverse together towards your home in the hereafter. So these things that pop up, whether it's betrayal, they are traumatic experiences, but it does not mean that it's the end of your relationship. It's the end of a version of your relationship or a version of reality, and it becomes an opportunity to, in this traumatic experience, to with the support of a facilitator, of a counselor, to work through this together. And it's a decision. You may decide, I don't want to work with this person together. It depends, or I don't want to continue that, and I think we should dissolve the relationship. But even in dissolving the relationship, it's something that you have to do. There's a healthy way to work through divorce, right? So it's a misconception that many people have that I thought was important.
Absolutely. And so if we're in this position where I have a spouse that is using and I want to help them, but I don't know how, what could I do, Zeyad? Having
someone in your circle. One of the things that, so we want to protect the honor of our spouse, right? But there are some challenges in life where we need to confide in someone else. Confide in, it could be a counselor. It could be a wise person in your family. Someone, again, that can help you get perspective. That's the most, it's the whole notion of when, the airplane is, they say, put your oxygen mask on first. Okay? Before helping those around you, put the oxygen mask on yourself first. And I've seen it time and time and time again. Many of the spouses of the users themselves become, first that curiosity. What is my spouse looking at? What are they doing? They themselves start looking at porn. And then they themselves in that trauma become addicted to the porn. There's a traumatic link to the porn, and they become addicted to the porn. Or they themselves start to cope with food, with the OCD patterns of, is it going to happen to me again and again and again? Most important thing you can do is put the oxygen mask on first. There are support groups today. There are ample and available resources for you. And it's important that you put the oxygen mask on first, because if you have a family, right, addictions are often called a family disease. It doesn't just affect the user, it affects the spouse, it affects the children. Especially if you have children in the picture, it's going to affect the dynamics of the whole household. And you need someone to anchor the household, so the rest of the household is not lost. And it starts with yourself. So having the oxygen mask on for yourself first, and having that support so you can take care of yourself, so you can take care of those who are there in front of you, and inshallah ta'ala that Allah uses you as a means to guide your spouse back to his obedience, to becoming that better version of themselves.
Right. Now, on that point of finding support or a mentor, now, do you recommend trying maybe somebody who's not in the family? Because I know that if I, let's say, speak to my, brother or my older sister or even one of my parents, now they have this knowledge about my spouse. And maybe one day, in a year, my spouse won't be using. Inshallah, if they sign up for PYG, that could be a reality.
Yeah.
So what exactly, because then now it's like they know that, right? So do you recommend maybe speaking to somebody who's not a family member? Or let's say if you're a woman, your best friend who lives on the other side of the country and she knows you're married, but she doesn't know your husband directly. Like, would you recommend somebody who's a little more, let's say, sanitized and not so close to home for this purpose?
That's a great point. And I think there's two things that we're looking at. So a close family member can serve as a means for intervention, as a means for a family member, someone who's there who can be impartial, right? It's not about taking sides, but the means it's about it's enough. Someone, if you have a spouse, your spouse is not listening to you. Your spouse is not taking you seriously. Having someone that kind of strikes some fear, some respect, where they can, and it's not by means of threatening, but it's by a means of the intervention is a means of helping them get the support that they need. Mm-hmm. So that's where confiding in a family member would be valuable. Someone who can serve that role and has that wisdom to serve that role. But otherwise, having someone like a counselor, having a therapist, having a coach, someone that can help guide you through that process where you can care for yourself, but then also place those boundaries in your life so they can facilitate or they can enable for your spouse to get that support is also very valuable.
Right. I would also recommend, those of us who are in this position to also research online and find what resources and advice there are for people who are married to someone in a pornography or sex addiction, and use the tools there that you feel are easiest for you at first, and just start with one or two items and take it day by day, and inshallah you start getting that wheel rolling. Because sometimes, Zeyad, what happens is I find out my spouse is an addict, the addict blames me, and now I feel like it's my fault, it's my responsibility. So that renders me as I am a victim now, not a villain, but I'm actually a victim of this person's, criticism and their addiction. And so sometimes we pull in a family member to kind of arm ourselves with that person to kind of make the other person now feel like they're the villain, right? So this is sometimes the politics or the emotional dynamic that takes place when both people aren't really grounded, or even, let's say, not as developed when it comes to emotional intelligence and intimacy capacity.
Absolutely. Not everybody has that capability, even though they may love you. They may not have that capability or the experience or the tools to be able to serve as that impartial guide. Now, we also have a workshop at Purify Your Gaze specifically around healing from betrayal. That's a great resource. You can find it on our website. And secondly, we will be offering counseling and support for spouses of addicts in the very near future, inshallah. So definitely reaching out to us at Purify Your Gaze is a great step to do that.
Inshallah. So, Sidi Ziyad, I wanted to maybe break down what would be some of the keys of actual intimacy. So if you were to kind of take a stab at it, what is intimacy? Some people hear that word and they think sex, or they think, oh, it means hugging somebody. What exactly does intimacy mean? How are you using it today?
It's a big question. I think that at the heart of intimacy is openness. Intimacy is openness. If we just look at a definition from the dictionary, intimacy is about closeness, and it's about two individuals that we're looking at the nakedness, where you can come in as yourself. You can be fully yourself without those barriers, and someone can see you as you are, and you can see someone as they are. And the ultimate goal with intimacy is to give love to that person, love in the form of action, for the nourishment and development of the other person. That's the ultimate aim of intimacy. It's the shared experience with someone close to you, with the intention and purpose of helping that person grow.
Right. Excellent. So this actually ties into a very important key concept, which is the first step of any change, which is self-knowledge or self-awareness. In other words, accepting, who you really are or what's true for you, even though it might be false, objectively speaking, but at least you have to get your own story straight, even if it's uncomfortable, because that's how you're going to start making change. You have to see that you have a problem, or that you desire things that are, pretty disgusting or deviated or whatever. You have to first own that, in a sense. And that doesn't mean that you say, oh, that's who I am, no judgment. No, but it's about, I really have to see this for what it truly is. And this is something that I hear often from people in recovery, is they start to notice a shift in their own relationship to the pornography, right? As they begin recovery, they start to, they act out along the way, but they still see there's a distance between the frequency and the intensity. And even when it occurs, it's like they start to feel like, I don't even want this anymore. I don't even feel like it's doing anything for me. So that self-knowledge of recognizing, what I am desiring, and also it's what's going to help you realize what you're not desiring. But bringing it back to this intimacy idea is that a quick story. I remember once a gentleman shared with me that, he had kind of this, good Muslim repertoire, involved in the community. There's this very strong external validation in his life. And so he was ashamed of sharing some of his, bedroom desires with his own wife. There wasn't anything crazy, by the way, right? But because his wife was also, this good Muslim woman and, involved in the community, he felt ashamed that I can't approach my nice, good Muslim wife with these desires. She's going to think I'm crazy, or I'm a pervert, or there's something wrong with me. How come I want this now? And subhanAllah, just by that part of being intimate or being open and honest, recognizing that this openness will bring him closer, he actually tried that, and turned out his wife wasn't shocked or dismissing at all. She's like, yeah, sure, we can try that, why not? And then subhanallah, that significantly reduced his desire and pull to act out, because then he realized later that half of the time he was acting out was because he was playing out fantasies that he believed he could never fulfill or voice to his own wife. Is this an example of intimacy, perhaps?
Intimacy is ultimately, it's about turning. What you mentioned right there is taking a risk, being vulnerable, coming as yourself, and turning towards your loved one. 100%. And the even there are many people that stop using pornography, but they have these hang-ups and these blocks around sex because their associations around sex are how do we call this, like they're almost stains on their heart from their experiences with pornography. So that there's that shame of fantasizing equals something bad. Again, those associations that we form. But in reality, when we can break the bonds that pornography has on us from imprinting, from beliefs, like this brother experienced, his spouse didn't have any issues, and ultimately, the fantasies need to be the crime that happens with pornography is that it's a degrading experience, and oftentimes those fantasies become twisted. It becomes about abusing. It's about power, and it doesn't nurture the relationship. So when you're expressing, there's nothing wrong with expressing your fantasies, but also reserve the right for your spouse to not be comfortable, especially if this is something new. So long as it's within we're not talking about halal haram here. So long as it's within that parameter, that's fine. But also recognize that give your spouse space as well to respond and to work through this together. There might not be any issue at all, but if there is, again, have that patience as well. That this is something you're cultivating together. It's not something. It's not a demand, and you need to do this for me. And it's about cultivating the relationship.
Of course. No, that's great because look, not all fantasies are, created equal, so to speak, right? Some fantasies are really deviated and distorted and they should not be in your life, right? And so this is another point here is I'm not trying to tell people that, whatever you've watched in pornography for the last 10 years, you're allowed to go ask your wife to do it. No, you have to be, of course, we're talking about things that maybe in some cases a person feels that it's a very limiting sexual relationship in their marriage, and that's kind of now the default menu. And so they're afraid to kind of add anything else to the menu, right? Because that's just the way it's always been, and I don't want to push my edges or whatever. And I also feel ashamed that I'm also a porn addict, right? So why do I have that right? So in this case, of course, we have to be use our discretion and wisdom. And naturally, if your spouse is open, then you explore things at a pace that makes both of you feel comfortable and confident and safe. And sometimes a person may not be ready for a certain, item on the menu, but they may be, open to, let's say, one of the appetizers. And once they get used to that, they can maybe evolve to different spaces of exploration with one spouse. This is the point that you're suggesting.
Yeah. And one of the exercises I've had couples do is actually taking a break, a 90-day break from actual genital intercourse. And in that space instead, focus on other forms of intimacy, other forms of physical touch, the appetizers that are kind of lost because porn gives a very restricted script that you must follow and, roles that have to be played. And in turn, you lose out the experience, the beauty of this space. So focusing on touch, focusing on just feeling, many times people engage in the relations, but they're not there. They're physically there, but they're not mentally there. They're not present, right? They're not emotionally present. And that's the joy that comes from this space is fueled by presence. And if you're not there, you're not going to experience, you're going to have that release, but it's going to be an empty experience. And in terms of, it doesn't satisfy me and I need to look outside.
Right. Remember, folks, pornography is an entertainment industry, just like a Hollywood movie. It's going to exaggerate and amplify things for the sake of its purpose of entertainment. And sexual entertainment is no different. It's going to have scripts. It's going to have unrealistic, scenes, etc. So this, of course, we all have to keep in mind. And also that porn and sexual addiction by its nature separates and disconnects. And what Zeyad and I are talking about here is intimacy, which is about unification, essentially, right? and that connection. And sexuality with intimacy is making love, and it's where you experience that, combination, multi-level combination, right? Of, it's not just the physical pleasure, it's the emotional, it's the eye contact, it's the spiritual. And those of us who've had that experience, we know there's a difference between that and something more mechanical, right? And so this is a very powerful tool. And I like your suggestion of, practicing different types of intimacy besides sexual intercourse full force, right? So these would include things like massage or snuggling or rubbing each other's back, or, finally mastering how to kiss each other. Some people just don't really know how to kiss well for years of being married. So these are the things that, number one, they establish deeper connection, more points of pleasure. Just like there's pain points, there's also pleasure points that we have to generate and push in our marriages. And we also can learn and discover parts of ourselves that maybe we never knew would ignite that flame for us. Like, some people have very interesting ways of being turned on, let's say, right? And so if you've never really put your hand over your spouse's body, besides just, I'm going to come do my thing and walk away, how are you going to discover those other corners or those other pleasure points that either of you have and can continue to share and give?
One of the things with to build on what you said, one of the things that is a reality with porn, it's very, very male-centered, or focused on the pleasure of the male. The point of view, quote unquote, is from the male point of view. The fantasies of a 12, 13-year-old boy, and twisted and demented. And really, what it does, it stunts many men from understanding how to pleasure and to meet the sexual needs, or understanding the quote-unquote mechanics behind how a woman is aroused. And I'm going to recommend, there's a book by the title Come As You Are. It's a great, great, great resource, and it will really help you understand the arousal process from the point of view of a woman. And I think having this kind of, removes that script that, hey, sex doesn't happen. You see each other, you dive right in, and, there is that warming up process. There are things that you have to fulfill for that physical,
process to open up.
Exactly.
Of course, because, I always tell brothers, look, you have to master how to give your wife an emotional orgasm before you can demand your physical orgasm all the time, right? And this is kind of what you're talking about.
And it's not to say that your wife wants a physical orgasm as well, right?
Of course. But I meant that's the most reliable gate or key. Right. And I would also argue it's the same for most men, right? Who are, alhamdulillah, their heart is, sound, right? Is that men also, let's face it, guys, if you're with a gorgeous woman who treats you like garbage and disrespects you, you're not going to have an emotional connection or intimacy. They're always criticizing you. They make you feel like you're nothing. And, you're not going to necessarily feel very drawn to want to make sexual relations or make love to that person either, would you? So men, of course, we're human beings, and we also don't realize that pornography, just like, going to, let's say, a particular school or academy or pop culture or film, music, these things have a level of indoctrination and conditioning. Let's face it. So when we think about this, Zeyad, pornography actually can indoctrinate us with a specific sexual appetite or sexual palate or brand, if you will, of sexuality. Like, oh, this is how it has to be in order for it to be successful in a certain way. And that's also one of the big dangers of sexuality. Just like if you watch, 10 hours of TV every day, you're going to become indoctrinated with the values and beliefs and worldview of whatever television you're watching, because that's just how it is. So sexuality also, we have to recognize that part of the prison that we put ourselves in is that we never actually authentically generate our own autonomous sexual culture with our spouses if we are indoctrinated and constantly streaming and downloading this stuff into our souls. What are your thoughts?
Absolutely. I think, sexy is not following a script, following someone else's script. What is sexy is what comes about, that passion, that blank canvas that you and your spouse have to draw together, to paint together, and what comes out in the moment, right? So, but if you are, again, in your mind, in your head, following the script, you're not there, you miss out on the, I'm looking for a word, the spontaneity that comes out and turns up the spice, turns up the excitement, things that you may not have even predicted becomes a turn on between you and your spouse. And that's why it's vital. It's vital that you completely eliminate. And there's a long period of time where you've eliminated the consumption of pornography. And porn is not just going to websites. We're talking about things like Netflix. I was just having a conversation with my own spouse about this. It's inescapable today. The sex scenes that are on Netflix. That has an effect as well on the heart. That has, so be mindful of what you're listening to, what you're watching, what you're consuming. These are poison arrows of the shaitan, as the Prophet ﷺ described it. And when we can have that space, that innocence, that joy, that passion can develop naturally, and you and your spouse, and even if there is that element of, there is that quote unquote, regardless of what the fantasy is, it's not going to be tainted by something else. It's not going to be tainted by something else.
Right. And I think that's a very powerful point, is presence is what actually cultivates more passion, more spontaneity, improvisation, if you will, in our love-making endeavors, right? So how are we ever going to have, like, people say, there's no passion, it's like, okay, well, we have to be present too, right? If you're complaining about that, then you have to first start to be present, because if you're not, and you're not picking up on signals or vibes or the ebb and flow of your day-to-day with your spouse, how are you going to break out into one of those, sessions or passionate sessions, right? So, of course, this presence, connection, the themes keep repeating themselves, subhanAllah, and it's essentially about, bringing it back to the shahada. It's like bearing witness to myself and to reality as it is. That's like the center of our deen, and that includes that authenticity and self-knowledge, and also relating to another in the same fashion. This is the ultimate goal, perhaps, of why we should be getting married.
Absolutely. And I think it's that's why it's such a travesty, why it's such a loss when you discover your spouse is betraying you. You think your version of what you experienced reality is completely turned upside down. And that's why it's really devastating. And really, I feel for the families, for the spouses going through such a trial, such a test. So it's not lost. It's not lost. But there is work that can, if you've never had it, and your spouse, first your spouse, starting with themselves, is willing to do the work to end this behavior, but then the both of you working together to develop this, to cultivate, it is possible. Just because, or if you feel that you had it but your spouse didn't, it's not lost forever either. There's going to be pain, and you may not be, for a long time, you're going to be hurt.
Right.
But your spouse, through the process of counseling, have a role to help in your healing as well.
Absolutely.
So just as you have a role with the placing of your boundaries, which kind of wakes up or shocks your spouse out of the heedlessness of addiction to facing reality, to facing and seeing the consequences of their action, and coming to terms that they have to change and doing that work. There's going to be if they're working with a good counselor, there's going to come a turning point where the narrative changes from me, which is in terms of the addict, and what many spouses complain about. First I lost my spouse to their addiction. Now they're lost in their counseling and
recovery.
Recovery and support group sessions. They never came back to me, right? They never came back home, right? So after this period, and we're looking probably at an 18-month, the entire process is a multi-year process. So if they're working with a good counselor, they're going to turn them back from the self-centered me to, okay, you've got to focus on, you don't know how to give, you don't know how to meet the needs of your spouse. Here's how we can start doing that.
Right. No, that's a great point, because sometimes the self-absorption and selfishness goes from, fulfilling the addiction to recovering from the addiction. And you're right, that could leave the spouse still hanging. And I think the other point is that in some cases I've worked with, when one spouse is going through the recovery, it actually opened up this whole new reality for the other spouse as well, to recognize, wow, like there's stuff I need to work on too. Because, for instance, if let's say a spouse was, let's say the man is an addict, and through the process of recovery, the wife realizes that she's also been very critical of her husband for many years, and that has pushed him deeper into the addiction. Again, it's not about blame, but it's about understanding the sequential or causal variables that are mixed up in this cocktail. And sometimes this alarm bell comes from Allah to help the couple themselves reboot and create perhaps a renaissance of their marriage to come. And this is what blew the lid on it, basically, right? Is that somebody was an addict or somebody got caught. Yeah. And so this is very good advice, yeah, that people don't lose hope. And remember, and I've witnessed it by Allah. I've seen, a husband who goes through this, and the wife, finds out, and then she supports. And then through that process, she optimizes and becomes a better version of herself too, and starts to address some of her own wounds or past pain. Because that has, played a role in where they both are today. So just to summarize, Zeyad, before you head out. So today we learned that we should not blame ourselves if we are, we find out that our spouse is addicted or using. It's not your fault, but we do want to understand the variables and the causes, and maybe even the role that all these different factors have played, including my own. Second is we want to get support, a mentor, somebody that we can vent and process and release, preferably somebody not too close to home. But if that's all you've got to work with, then you have to be, discretionary about it. Obviously, don't tell your mom or your dad if they already never liked them since the wedding day, right? You got to be selective. Three, we mentioned that we should check out resources online. Of course, Purify Your Gaze is one that is culturally and religiously sensitive to the Muslim community, so that's a great place to go get some free resources and sign up, as well as other websites and support groups. And I think the one of the biggest keys we shared today is trying to cultivate and practice intimacy and closeness. And sometimes that just means simple things like being present, asking how your spouse is doing. And this is both sides, by the way, whether you're the addict or the supporter of the addict, checking in about people's emotions on a day-to-day basis. When your spouse is upset. Once a brother, who is an addict, his wife left the home because of, this acting out, and every time he acted out, she would go, to her family's home, and he would say to me, look, I don't know what to do. And I said, look, all you need to do is reach out to her. It's that simple. Call her. Say you're sorry. Say, this is really hard for me, and I hate to see you like this. It's not you. I'm just weak right now. I'm working on it. And just being vulnerable and having that intimacy gave her comfort. And guess what? She came home. And she actually said, I would love to be intimate with you, and we don't have to have sex if you're not ready. So the wife was actually so supportive and patient with him just by him being present. And I always tell brothers, I say, look, sometimes all you need to do to heal is be present with yourself and your spouse. That's going to help them get that security and trust again. But they're not going to trust you if you keep avoiding them and they keep pushing you away, and you keep thinking, when am I going to finally be able to get rid of this? And you're still living in that disconnect, even though you're in recovery and the other spouse is kind of waiting for it. So final thoughts, Zeyad, before we end today.
Final thoughts. Alhamdulillah, we covered a lot. I think really the core message here is, regardless of where you find yourself on the spectrum, how bad you think, it's not you think, how bad you have it, there is hope. There really is hope. And alhamdulillah, as I started the show, we are in our 10th year of being around as an organization. We've seen all shades and really heartbreak. We've been in it together with the couples, the families, the men and women,
the parents.
parents, yeah, the parents whose lives have been turned upside down by this addiction. And regardless of where you find yourself, there is hope. And we know from the Prophet ﷺ, for every disease there is a cure. There is a cure, and I love I think it's Imam Zayd who says, come as you are to Islam as it is. And our goal ultimately, we are all imperfect human beings, and we need people we can't get to that better version of ourselves by ourselves. We need people to help guide us along the way. Resources like counseling, resources. We have so many more resources today than we did 10 years ago. The landscape of understanding has completely changed. There are no excuses to reach out for support. So there is hope, but don't stay where you're at and wallow or suffer. And this is an opportunity. Everything that you go through is a trial and test Allah knows that you can handle. And it's an opportunity, as sucky as it feels, as painful as it feels, you can get through this, but you have to have that willingness to go through it. And you will get through it by Allah's tawfiq, inshallah ta'ala. And on the other side, there will be bliss. Things may not come out exactly as you expected, but they will always be better than you expected. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala never puts us in a situation except that there's something better waiting on the other side in this life and the next life. And so I'm saying this from deep conviction, having experienced it, being in the trenches with many couples, parents, individuals. I know that it can work for you too. And if inshallah ta'ala you give us the privilege in being a means of support to you, we look forward to supporting you on your journey, inshallah ta'ala.
Jazakallah khair, Brother Zeyad. Don't forget that when you do, Allah does, and those who are sincere in heart, use their body with effort and educate their mind, they have a much higher chance of success. We have seen it, and check out purifyyourgaze.com today to learn more and sign up. Zeyad, thank you so much for joining me.
Jazakallah khair.